Hi everyone, thank you for watching this video. In this video, I talk about 10 Persian poets you should know as a great introduction to Persian literature and history. I'll briefly talk about the poets, their legacy, example poems to give you a flavor. At the end, I'll also discuss some common themes among them and importance of Persian language. I'll also tell you two of my favorites. But first, let me answer the question, why Persian poetry? First off, let me clarify one thing for my non-Persian audience. Persian language uses Arabic alphabet with some minor differences, but on the whole, Persian and Arabic speakers can read each other's languages. However, when it comes to meaning, they are very different. Arabic belongs to Semitic branch of language family, which is similar to Hebrew, while Persian is an Indo-European language, meaning its roots is closer to Hindi than Arabic. But Persian has adapted too many Arabic vocabulary. My research, though not scientific, suggests that 20 to 40% of Persian words come from Arabic. A good analogy would be English. It's Germanic at its roots, but borrowed 30% of its words from French. However, French and English are from the same branch of Indo-European family, while Persian and Arabic are of different families. Now, there are a few different names here. In Iran, Persian is called Farsi, which is Arabized version of Parsi. Incidentally, Parsi is also the name of a minority in India, a Persian-speaking Zoroastrians who fled the Muslim conquest in 7th century CE. But Parsis in India today don't speak Persian anymore. Instead, they speak Hindi and Gujarati languages and are one of the richest people in India. About 60% of Iranians speak Persian as their first language. In Afghanistan, about 50% of the country speaks Persian, and they call it Dari as an official name. But most people on the street still call it Farsi. In Tajikistan, they refer it to as Tajik, and they write it in Russian alphabet or Cyrillic alphabet. So people in all these countries can communicate with one another for the most part. In Iran, there's a French influence. For example, in Iran, the most used word for thank you is merci. This is to do with the Iranian intellectuals being educated in France in 19th and early 20th century. In Afghanistan, there's a more English influence due to the British India, and in Tajikistan, Russian influence due to the Soviet Union. One of the coolest things about Persian language is its long history of poetry. It doesn't have a prose history like European or East Asian languages, but its poetry is perhaps the best in the world. The influence of Persian poetry on European literature is immense. Goethe, the father of German literature, wrote a book in which he conversed with Hafeez, the Persian poet. Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, or poetry, was a huge hit in Victorian England and later in America. Today, the poetry of Rumi is immensely popular in the West. Also, speaking of medieval Islamic poetry, some of the biggest literary names are in fact Persian language poets. Okay, let me give you a concrete example on the importance of poetry. If you have read The Kite Runner by Khalid Hosseini, which I discussed here a while back, in it the characters play a game, not a sport but a battle with poems, called Shejangi, in which each contestant has to recite a poem that begins with the last letter of the previous poem. This means most people have many poems memorized throughout their lifetime to sustain a game, which shows the importance of poetry in the Persian-speaking world. Today, Beowulf, written 1,000 years ago in English, or Canterbury Tales 700 years ago, or even Shakespeare 500 years ago are challenging for most English speakers. But Persian poetry written 1,000 years ago is 90% understood by most speakers today. This shows the power of Persian poetry on the language unchanged. Why is that? Persian poets wrote for the common people. Poetry is music for the people. One of the most important aspects of Persian poetry is the rhythm and rhyme, which makes the effect almost impossible to translate to other languages. To enjoy Persian poetry, one has to hear it in Persian. Persian speakers are extremely passionate. Thus, poetry is extremely important. Passion reigns supreme in the region. Some Iranian scholars lament that due to significant importance of emotion, the people value rationality less. Thus, they couldn't continue their renaissance and the Europeans moved faster because they valued rationality more. I think there's a merit to this theory. If you go 1,000 years ago, the Persian-speaking regions were the center of science and great innovations. But instead of capitalizing on this, the people enjoyed poetry more. So much so that one of the most important poets on this list was actually a scientist. And today everyone knows him not for his scientific contributions, but his poetry. Emotional and passionate people tend not to care about material success, which is at the heart of European civilization of the past 5 centuries. Another element of Persian literature is the influence of Zoroastrianism, an old religious branch of Zoroastrianism, a belief that time is the ultimate power in the world. This meant that humans had no chance against time, which we call fatalism. This belief that your fate is sewn and you can do nothing about it is reflected in the Persian poetry. I discussed the influence of Zoroastrianism in my video on Ferdowsi's Epic of Shahnameh in more detail. Okay, now let's talk about the 10 poets you should know. Rudaki was considered the father of Persian literature because he was the first major poet to revive the language following the 7th century Arab conquests. His name Rudaki refers to his birthplace Rudak, which is today in Tajikistan. He was a court poet during the Samanid dynasty based in Bukhara, today Uzbekistan. The Samanids court promoted Persian language and culture due to its distance from Baghdad, the capital of Islamic power, hence less influenced by Arabic language, so Persian language could flourish in Bukhara. It is said that Rudaki was blind and used the musical instrument to compose his poems. He mainly wrote about his patron, the Samanid king, as well as nature and pleasures of life. Today, very little of his poetry has survived. I'll read a couple of examples here. Look at the cloud, how it cries like a grieving man. Thunder moans like a lover with a broken heart. Now and then the sun peeks from behind the clouds like a prisoner hiding from the guard. Here's another example. Now we're drunk, so let's drink wine. Let's drink from the hands of beauties. They call us crazy and senseless. We are not crazy, we are drunk. Rabia Balkhi, as the name suggests, was from Balkh, today Afghanistan. She was also at the court of Samanids in Bukhara. Her fate is a bit tragic because she fell in love with a slave. It is said that her brother killed her as she refused to give up on her romance. Today, a lot of women in Afghanistan consider Rabia as their patron saint and take inspiration from her. There's very little known about her and very few of her poems have survived. Here's an example. I am caught in love's web so deceitful. None of my endeavors turned fruitful. I know not when I rode the high-blooded steed. The harder I pulled its reins, the less it would heed. Love is an ocean with such vast space. No wise man can swim it in any place. A true lover should be faithful till the end, and face life's reprobated trend. When you see things hideous, fancy them neat. Eat poison, but taste sugar sweet. Ferdowsi is like the Shakespeare of Persian literature. His creation, Shahnameh, or the Persian Book of Kings, is in fact the longest poem by a single author, with some 50,000 couplets. It is considered the most important book of Persian literature, which I have talked about on this channel quite a lot. I should give credit to another man here, another poet whose life was cut short. Dakiki started Shahnameh and wrote a major part of it before he was killed by his own slave. So Ferdowsi took up the challenge and spent 30 years of his life to complete it. Unlike these other poets, Ferdowsi wrote at home. Apart from Shahnameh, he didn't write anything major. After spending 30 years writing Shahnameh, Ferdowsi says, I've reached the end of this history, and all the land will fill with talk of me. I shall not die. These seeds I've sown will save my name and reputation from the grave. The men of sense and wisdom will proclaim, and when I have gone, my praises and my fame. For Ferdowsi, life was short, so the only thing you could do with it was to leave a great legacy, and he did. Omar Khayyam, though known as a poet today, was in fact a scientist. His works in astronomy and mathematics were revolutionary at the time. One of the most important contributions was to correct the solar calendar, which is still used in Iran and Afghanistan, unlike the Islamic lunar calendar used in most Arabic countries. I discussed the story of Omar Khayyam in my video on Samarkand, a novel by the Lebanese-French author Amin Maalouf. Omar Khayyam in the West is known by his Rubaiyat, translated by Edward Fitzgerald in Victorian England. It was such a massive hit that Khayyam's poems became a cliché for later generations because it was everywhere. Christopher Hitchens, the English journalist, claimed Khayyam's poetry as one of the earliest atheist writings in the world. As you will see, his poems do question the religious view of the world. Khayyam was a scientist, an empiricist, so he believed in what he could prove. There was no proof for heaven or hell, so he came to the conclusion that this life is it. There is no afterlife, therefore one should enjoy it. Here's an example. O threats of hell and hopes of paradise, one thing at least is certain, this life flies. One thing is certain, and the rest is lies. The flower that once has blown forever dies. Sanai lived in Ghazna, modern-day Afghanistan, at the heart of Ghaznavid dynasty, who were famous for raiding India and looting its treasures. This revelation had a huge impact on him, and he became a mystic poet as a result. Today he is one of the most famous Sufi poets. His masterpiece, The Walled Garden of Truth, is considered an epic of mysticism and had a huge influence on future Persian poets like Rumi. His main philosophy was that seeking truth or God outside was pointless. You can only find truth inside. He believed in the idea that God is not an external entity but inside everyone. One can see a slight Buddhist influence on him, that to get to the truth, one has to cease to exist as an individual, which is the same as in Buddha's belief that the self as we know doesn't really exist. This influence perhaps was due to his visit to India. Also, Afghanistan was once the center of Buddhism, as we can see from the giant Buddha statues in Bamiyan, which is fairly close to Ghazni. Prior to the Islamic conquest, central Afghanistan, where Sanai lived, was a Buddhist country. Sanai even retells a famous Buddhist story of an elephant in a city of blind people. As they cannot see, they touch to understand what the elephant is. Each person touches a particular part of the elephant and deduces something, but none of them understand the whole. Through this metaphor, Sanai tells us that we cannot know the world fully. Our knowledge is always relative and limited. For Sanai, we cannot understand God through reason alone and rejects duality, as he says. We tried reasoning our way to him. It did not work. But the moment we gave up, no obstacle remained. He introduced himself to us out of kindness. How else could you have known him? Reason took us as far as the door, but it was his presence that let us in. But how will you ever know him? As long as you are unable to know yourself. Once one is one, no more, no less, error begins with duality. Unity knows no error. If you've seen the film The Shape of Water, at the end is this poem. Unable to perceive the shape of you, I find you all around me. Your presence fills my eyes with your love. It humbles my heart, for you're everywhere. People have attributed this to Sanai, and the film's credit section acknowledges it. Sanai is the first major Persian Sufi poet, and later we have two more figures, Atar and perhaps the most famous one, Rumi, which I'll talk later. Nizami was born in Ganja, today Azerbaijan, thus referred to as Nizami Ganjavi. He is perhaps the best known romantic poet of Persian literature. He's famous for writing Khamsa, 5 love stories such as Layli Majnun, Khusro Shirin, The Tale of Alexander, and 7 Beauties. He was influenced by Ferdowsi's epic and Sanai's Sufism, so he combined the epic of storytelling with Sufi notion of love. In my video on the Georgian national epic, The Knight and Panther Skin by Shota Dostoevsky, I discussed that the national poet of Georgia and Nizami lived around the same time in the Caucasus, not far from each other. Some even have suggested that they might have met, but it's impossible to know as there is no evidence to support except that their works are quite similar. Nizami's influence on European art is massive. Just as an example, Puccini's last opera, Turandot, is based on Nizami's 7 Beauties. Turandot in Persian means daughter of Turan. In Sanai's tale, it's the princess of a Slav people who live in the north. In Persian epic Shahnameh, Turan means the north of Oxus River, today Central Asia. Puccini has the exact same story but set in China, and unfortunately no credit to Nizami. Here is an example from Layli Majnun epic. This text requires a single name, not 2. He answered them, Majnun alone will do. If someone delves within a lover's heart, he will find the loved one in its deepest part. heart. But why? They asked him. From among the two, it's Layla who's been cut away, not you. It's wrong, he said, for her to be cover that hides within itself this ardent lover. I am the veil for what should be internal. I am the outer shell, she is the kernel. Atar lived in the same area as Ferdowsi in Nishapur, not in court but at home. His name Atar means chemist or someone selling perfume. Atar is famous for his epic tale called The Conference of Birds. The story goes that all birds of the world come together to elect their king. The hoopoe bird takes them all through a journey of 7 valleys, each with a specific theme such as love, knowledge, poverty, and so forth, to meet the mythical Simur or the bird of phoenix. By the end of this journey, they realize that they must find their own paths in life. Jorge Luis Borges mentions this tale in one of his short stories, The Approach to Al-Mutasim. Atar was killed during the Mongol invasion in 1220. There's a legend that Rumi, as he was fleeing the Mongols on his way to Anatolia, met with Atar. Thus, he attributes his influence to him and Sanai. Here's a poem by Atar. Your face is neither infinite nor ephemeral. You can never see your own face, only a reflection, not the face itself. So you sigh in front of mirrors and cloud the surface. It's better to keep your breath cold. Hold it like a diver does in the ocean. One slight movement, the mirror image goes. Don't be dead or asleep or awake. Don't be anything. What you most want, what you travel around wishing to find, lose yourself as lovers lose themselves, and you will be that. Rumi was born in Balkh, today Afghanistan, but fled the Mongol invasion, so he lived most of his life in modern-day Turkey under the rule of Sultan of Rome, the Persian-speaking Seljuk Turks, thus named Rumi, which means from Rome. In Persian-speaking world, he is known as Jalaluddin Balkhi, or simply as Maulana, meaning the master. In fact, many of Persian poets were patronized by the Persian-speaking Turks, like Ghaznavids and Seljuks. When the Turks conquered the Persian-speaking world, just like Mongols, they adapted Persian as their court language, which tells us that they greatly admired the language and culture. Later on, the Ottoman Turks replaced Persian with Turkish. Rumi has been a big hit in America in recent years and has overtaken Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet, in terms of sales. Even Beyoncé named her child Rumi. Rumi's friendship with the Shams of Tabriz transformed him and considered one of the most influential friendships in literature. They lived together for about 40 days, which Alef Shafak uses in her novel's title, 40 Rules of Love. And then Shams suddenly disappeared. This devastated Rumi, but through his poetry, he kept Shams's ghost alive for the rest of his life. Rumi follows Sanai's philosophy of unity between God and those seeking truth. Rumi also believed in cyclical nature of time, not only that everything is repeated, but there's also a progression. In other words, every new cycle is an improvement on the previous entity. Like Sanai, Rumi believed that we understand the world better through our emotional expressions such as dance, music, singing, rather than the expression of reason such as science and technology. This is very Persian way of seeing the world, passion and emotion at the heart of their outlook. Now I'll read 3 sample poems by Rumi. I died as a mineral and became a plant and rose to animal. I died as animal and I was a man. Then what should I fear? I have never become less from dying. Here's another one. I had said if you come, I will tell you my sorrows. What would I say when you come and my sorrow is gone? And finally, I choose to love you in silence, for in silence I find no rejection. I choose to love you in loneliness, for in loneliness no one owns you but me. I choose to adore you from a distance, for distance will shield me from pain. I choose to kiss you in the wind, for the wind is gentler than my lips. I choose to hold you in my dreams, for in my dreams you have no end. Saadi was born in Shiraz, but due to the Mongol invasion, he became a wanderer, traveling to many places. He was said to have no time for the kings or elites. Instead, he enjoyed the company of common people. As a result, today's Saadi's poetry is perhaps the easiest to understand by ordinary Persian speakers. He's famous for two books of poetry, Bostan or the Orchard and Gulistan or the Rose Garden. He also had a huge influence on the German literature as well as American intellectuals like Ralph Waldo Emerson. Saadi's basic philosophy was that of existentialism, an acute awareness of your own life and those of others. Due to his humanist philosophy, one of his poems is hung on the walls of the United Nations headquarters in New York on a Persian carpet. It reads, "Human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain." Hafeez was also from Shiraz. He is perhaps the most famous poet among Persian speakers. His divan or poetry collection is so popular that people say it is in every house next to the copy of the Quran. Coincidentally, his name means a person who has memorized the Quran. Divan-e-Hafeez is used by young people today like a book of luck or horoscope to find love. So he is like Saint Valentine among the love-seeking youth in Iran and Afghanistan. Goethe, the greatest German writer, was so impressed with Hafeez that he wrote a book called East-West Divan, a kind of conversation with Hafeez. Nietzsche, the philosopher, also loved Hafeez's poetry due to his Dionysian wine-loving free spirit and his criticism of the religious clergies. As we know, Nietzsche wasn't a big fan of religious priests. Hafeez's tomb in Shiraz is a pilgrimage spot among his fans and readers. If you visit it, you can also visit Saadi's tomb, which is not far from Hafeez's. Hafeez mainly wrote about love, wine, and his disdain for the clergies. Here's an example. "The heavenly breeze comes to this state. I sit with the wine and the lovely mate. Why can't the beggar play the king's role? The sky is the dome, the earth is my state. The green grass feels like paradise. Why would I trade these for the garden gate? With bricks of wine build towers of love. Being bricks of clay is our final fate. Seek no kindness of those full of hate. People of the mosque with the church debate. Don't badmouth me, don't blacken my name. Only God can my story narrate. Neither Hafeez's corpse nor his life negate. With all his misdeeds, heavens for him wait." Here's another one. "The corner of tavern is my altar where I pray. At dawn the mantra of the old Magi I say. Fear not if the harp plays not at sun's morning ascent. My morning cry of repentance is the music I play. Thank God, free from beggars and kings away I stay. Homage to the beggar at the door of the beloved I pay. For thee in the mosque and the tavern my time I spent. By God, from this intent I never ran nor walked astray." And finally, "Only angel of death's blade can uproot my tent. Running from love and grace has never been my way. From the time that I made my search for thee my intent, I lean upon the throne on which the sun may lay. Not your fault was the sins that were put into your clay. Nonetheless accept them, Hafeez, and good taste display." So, as we can see, the early poets like Rudaki, Balkhi, Ferdowsi, Sanai lived far from Baghdad in places like modern-day Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, eastern Iran. Therefore, were somewhat immune from the influence of Arabic, so they could revive Persian language instead. But later on, some of these poets moved westward due to the 13th century Mongol invasion, like Rumi, Saadi, and Hafeez. Just like the Turks before them, the Mongols later adopted Persian as their language and even took it to India until the British showed up and replaced it with English. Some scholars believe that it was the Mongols who adapted and promoted Persians against the influence of Arabic, therefore saved the language. Unlike other countries like Egypt that was totally Arabized, the Persian-speaking people kept their language, all thanks to the Mongols. But of course, today most Iranians blame the Mongols for their cultural demise. Another thing we notice is how widespread Persian was in those days. For example, from Ghazna in the southeast, Bukhara northeast, Ganja and Konya in northwest, and Shiraz southeast. Persian-speaking world encompassed a large area. Today it's still spoken in many countries, Iran of course, but also Afghanistan, Tajikistan, parts of Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan. We also see a common theme that runs through all the poets' writings. Religious topics are very common in all their poetry, but also life itself being quite tough and its meaning challenging. Many of them devoted their lives to Sufism, a kind of withdrawal from materialism in search of deeper meaning. Another element is also very common, that is, to face it all, it is best to chill out and enjoy life with wine. This is particularly apparent in poetry of Khayyam, which Victorian England loved, and also in Hafeez. My favorite among these poets are of course Khayyam and Hafeez. Now you know what kind of person I am, a wicked alcoholic. I'm joking. I feel the poetry of Khayyam and Hafeez express how I feel about the world myself. Today, Persian poetry has changed significantly. Modern poets have abandoned the rhyme format for a more free verse format. The most famous of these modern poets is Ahmad Shamlu, who through his poetry bridged the past greats with the present time. Some people think that if Shamlu was a European language poet, he would have been known as one of the greatest poets in the world, with the same fame and prestige as some Spanish language poets of South America. He used great imagery depicting everyday life and the human condition. Here's an example. The Secret, translated by Sheda Dayani. A secret was with me, I told the mountain. A secret was with me, I told the well. On the lengthy path, alone and lonesome, I told the black horse, I told the stones. With my old secret, at last I arrived. I uttered no words, you uttered no words. I was shedding tears, you were shedding tears. Then I sealed my lips, you read from my eyes. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want me to dive deeper and talk about any of these poets and also win a copy of Khayyam's poetry in English, please leave a comment. Thank you.